we are not so heavily reliant on subsidies for the growth of the market. In fact, large-scale power plants in Brazil today are the cheapest way to produce electricity for the country, and it's renewable. That's a plus, but it's the cheapest way.
Welcome to The Smarter E Special, a podcast miniseries recorded live at the Smarter E Europe 2022 in Munich. It was time again for everyone working on making the new energy world a reality to meet in person. And of course, I wanted to be part of the conversation as well. So I traveled to Munich and spent 3 days at the exhibition. I was able to secure some quality time with various experts and sit down with them for a one-on-one chat on the latest industry developments. These are our conversations. Welcome to the second episode of our mini-series here, and for the second episode we really wanted to stay true to our international focus in the English version of the Smarter E podcast, and we're looking into the Brazilian market because it is one of the most exciting markets in regards to PV in the world. It ranks number 7 in global top solar markets in 2022-2021 with I think around 5.5 gigawatt of installed solar PV capacity, which also makes it the biggest market for solar PV in Latin America. So to make sure that we really get an insight into the market and also are able to put it into the international context, I went down to the exhibition grounds here and I hunted down Rodrigo Sauaia because he not only is the co-founder and CEO of ABSOLAR, so the Brazilian Photovoltaic Solar Energy Association, but he's also the co-founder and co-chairman of the Global Solar Council, GSC, so a global entity unifying and representing the solar power sector on an international level. So he's the person to give us both perspectives on the market, the national and the international market. Well, awesome that you took some time here. I know I had to drag you out from a very busy booth conversation here. Glad you joined me in my little silent podcast room here. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to everyone who's listening to us today.
And as we speak, by the way, it's the second day of the Smarter E in general, the first day of the exhibition, and it's the 11th of May. So just to put our podcast recording here also in a timeline. I have to admit, it's the international podcast, but let's be true. We usually are stuck a little bit in a Eurocentric vision of renewables and the energy transition. So it's really great to open up that a little bit with you. But I think the most important thing coming with a very European perspective on my behalf is to actually see what the Brazilian power sector looks like. What are really the important differences compared to what we're used to here in Europe? And then later on, how does that translate to the decarbonisation strategy? But let's start maybe with what's the power sector comprised of in Brazil?
That's an excellent question, Zach, because the Brazilian electricity matrix, differently from what we see throughout the world, is already 83% renewable. So that's a big difference. And the majority of this renewable energy, about 60% of the electricity matrix in the country, comes from hydropower. So large-scale power plants with big dams as well. And this comes from the history of Brazil investing in hydropower in the past. We still have a lot of hydro resource, but now it's in regions such as the Amazon region, where there's a lot of social and environmental potential impacts that make these projects difficult for future expansion and new power plants. And after the use of a lot of hydro, Brazil started to diversify its electricity matrix with thermoelectric power plants, and later on invested a lot in renewable energy sources. So today, wind is number 2 in our electricity matrix with 11%, and then natural gas comes 3 with 8.6%. Close to it, biomass with 8.3%, and then we have other thermoelectric power plants based on fossil fuels with 4.8%. And then comes solar, with large-scale solar power plants as the 6th biggest electricity source in the country, with 2.6%. That's about 5 gigawatts on large-scale power plants. If we add the distributed generation there, we go to 15 gigawatts, and that makes solar then our number 5 electricity source in the country already.
So that's really impressive, because on the one hand, you're one of the fastest growing, biggest PV markets with 5.5 gigawatt, as we said. But in the context of Brazil itself, it's almost an insignificant number, because on place 6 or 5 and all the others are almost all of them are also renewable energy sources. So that is really impressive. And that's a very different scenario from, for example, Germany here. So let's break that down a little bit. When you talk decarbonization in Brazil, what actually do you need to decarbonize then? Because here in Germany, it means, or in Europe, it's obviously the energy mix, and also now it's become a geopolitical question. We need to get rid of Russian oil and gas. Very different for you in Brazil. What's the main focus, the main leverage in decarbonizing Brazil?
Yes, first point that we have to understand is that usually we speak in Brazil much more about diversifying our electricity portfolio, because currently we're still very heavily reliant on hydropower, and that is not good for a country that is so susceptible to climate change as Brazil is. We already saw several severe droughts in current years, and that impacts a lot our electricity generation capacity because it's based on hydro. So the government is doing a long-term strategy to diversify, and solar comes very handy as a competitive and fast electricity source that Brazil has a lot of resource to take advantage of and to improve its electricity matrix. So when we talk about reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil, we're basically talking about, number one, reducing deforestation that is still very high on our forests, such as the Amazon region, the Pantanal region, the Atlantic forest region, but also on reducing the impacts of the agribusiness with methane emissions, also with increasing land use area from agribusiness, and the transportation sector. So these are the sectors currently that generate more greenhouse gas emissions and the ones that are in focus when we talk about reducing these emissions.
So transport sector, agriculture, and decelerating deforestation. All right. I have to gather my thoughts because there were so many interesting points there. I think what's interesting is that for you, it also is a question of energy security, but from a very different angle. Whereas with us, it's a geopolitical question. For you, it's a question because you will actually be amongst the first to be impacted directly by climate change. And that's quite interesting to see that different angle there. And of course, it makes sense. I mean, Brazil is situated perfectly in terms of sun radiation to boost solar. So what needs to be done to really increase the share of solar PV in the Brazilian energy mix?
Well, yes, we do have the solar resource. Just to do a very quick comparison with our fellow friends from Europe, the average irradiation in Brazil is twice as high as in Germany or in the UK. So the same solar system in Brazil can produce twice as much as electricity in a given year. And because of that, we are not so heavily reliant on subsidies for the growth of the market. In fact, large-scale power plants in Brazil today are the cheapest way to produce electricity for the country, and it's renewable. That's a plus, but it's the cheapest way. And when we look into small-scale distributed generation that is currently leading the market in solar power in Brazil, generating our electricity in your rooftop has an average return on investment of between 4 and 6 years. So it's a very good investment. And this has the support of a net metering scheme. And we need to improve regulations and also long-term contracting from the government to get the ball rolling even faster for Brazil. Access to financing is also something important that we are looking at, and also reducing taxation on components and on the energy produced by solar power that still hinders some of the market growth.
Once again, a statement with so many points that we will have to break down individually here, Rodrigo. So first, what I caught in just one sentence that you said, that PPAs are very effective in Brazil just because the yield of PV power is so big. So that was quite interesting. But on the other hand, you also said that for small decentralized solar, the time I need to get my invested money back seems to be half of the time I would need here in Europe, for example. So now you already mentioned distributed solar power. I think Brazil has a very highly centralized energy system, which I guess also comes with challenges on the long run. So Brazil just introduced a new distributed energy law. What are the main objectives of it? Is it to make the energy grid more resistant? Is it to boost, more like rooftop solar, for example? Yeah, what's your take on that?
Well, Brazil used a mechanism to incentivize the use of small-scale distributed renewable energy based on North American experience, mainly net metering regulation. And this regulation was implemented and had a lot of success in bringing online 10 gigawatts of small-scale PV since 2012, so in the last 10 years or so. But this regulation was under attack by distribution companies who felt they were being left behind in this process. And the law brings a lot of certainty to resolve this conundrum, which is always a trouble and a difficult path for the future. How do you get solar growing without resistance from distribution companies? We believe we are reaching a reasonable middle term.
So you reach like a fair compromise, that is to say, and you balanced out the different interests. Exactly. Are there still some obstacles remaining to decentralize the energy market even more?
Yes, there are, because this law that was recently approved still needs to be regulated. So there will be at least 1 year to get everything structured and regulated. And this is essential. The way that this regulation is done will help us, for example, incorporate energy storage, or it may hinder also the use of energy storage. It can help hybrid systems combining different renewable energy technologies such as wind and solar, or the other way around. So the way this is implemented is very important, and we will be working thoroughly on this subject with our associate members to get sure that the result is positive for the growth of the market. Apart from that, we have been working also on establishing new rules for energy storage, because this is a segment, a part of the market that is not developed in Brazil yet.
Before we talk about storage, maybe let's complete the picture, because it's amazing growth that you're experiencing. But I think some other challenges that you had, apart from, for example, grid distributors trying to maybe hinder one or the other development, it's investment conditions maybe are not that favorable. I think you still have, you can give me an update, high import taxes that really hinder the development of solar capacities. What strategies are in place to overcome these bottlenecks?
Well, regarding investment conditions, it's important to know that Brazil has usually a higher interest rate compared to European countries, for example. So you have to understand that getting a loan to develop a project in Brazil has its costs. But on the other hand, the market, as we discussed very briefly, has also a very high return on investment. So you can balance that between these two sides. The Brazilian currency, so if you get financing in local currency, this is good because it gets your financial returns based on the currency. But you also, if you're bringing money from abroad, from international markets, be aware of the currency exchange ratio, because it can fluctuate a lot. And regarding taxation, we had in the past high taxes for solar components, and the government has from time to time reduced these taxes for solar power, which is a good sign. Even this year, this happened once again, reduction of taxations on solar components and battery components as well. And this is something that we have been working with the government, because once you reduce these taxes, you make the technology much more accessible and democratized to all types of consumers, not only large-scale consumers or more structured industrial and commercial consumers, but also the residential consumers, the low-income housing, and it's important for us to have a solution for solar that's accessible to all.
So it's maybe a little bit more a complex picture from what I got. Some things are different just to the market here, like the high interest rate, as you said. On the other hand, the return is bigger. And then just when going into the market, like the exchange rate bit was very interesting. So it probably makes a sense to just turn to a partner like ABSOLAR when you want to enter the market, to do it the right way.
For sure, especially because we can help also with understanding the Brazilian culture of doing business. And this is something that you don't learn by the books necessarily. And so Brazilians are very warm and personal people. And it's important for a company that wants to build its brand to also reinforce the team that it will have there, the people that it will have there, and the connections between these people and the local players.
That's really interesting, because that's something that we never talk about, is really like the intercultural aspect of doing business. And I can imagine if Germans come to Brazil, that really would take some cultural translation to really make sure there's not any misunderstandings or disappointments, simply because it's a different style of doing business. So we should do an extra episode on that. That would be so interesting. Now, one thing is that Brazil used to be very protective about the market, also politically. Is that still so? Is that something that ABSOLAR supports? What's your take on that?
Well, we are pro-free market. So in our view, it's important to open as much the competition as possible, because this, in the end, helps the market and the consumers to get better products at lower prices. So we are not in favor of artificial national barriers that can hinder the development of the market. And in this regard, we have been discussing with the government positive ways to foster and develop a local value chain, for example, without incurring in these types of barriers or taxations of goods coming from abroad. So this has to do with really working with quality, trying to get the standards right, implement best practices in the country, and also help with financing the companies that are in Brazil and want to use Brazilian equipment. And there are equipments available.
That's quite interesting. So what you're working on is really making the local production, local companies and local business models competitive with the international market, which sounds just like a much more sustainable approach than keeping up the protective policies. So you already mentioned storage. With PV being so popular, and specifically also a lot of like rooftop and privately owned PV being so popular, storage seems to be a logical step, but I think it is, compared to the PV market, rather small. So why is that? Are there any technical or regulatory challenges that hinder storage?
Yes, this is one of the areas where ABSOLAR have been working very strongly with the support of our associate members to develop a roadmap and best practices to establish the storage market and make it grow in the country. And I would say that we are working basically on 4 different barriers that we have identified. One of them is the lack of regulation and legal framework to support and give stability for players to invest in storage in Brazil. So this is something that we're developing together with the regulatory agency, the Brazilian regulatory agency, and the Ministry of Mines and Energy and the Congress. There is another area where we are working, which is taxation. For some components of energy storage, taxes can go as high as 70%, which is crazy. I mean, it almost doubles the price of your component. So this is something that we're working with the Ministry of Economy to get lower taxation on these goods. Another area where we are working are technical standards that are still lacking because the technology has not been needed and implemented so routinely. And because of that, the technical standards have not been developed accordingly as well. I mean, one thing requires the other, right? And at the end, you need financing to get this market going. So many financial institutions that are operating in Brazil are familiar with renewable already, but not so much with energy storage. So they need to really understand this business model, this new business model, to actually become comfortable for investing in this technology. So that's another area where we are working with.
Okay, so PV is booming, and with storage, you still need to clear the road of one or the other taxation that still is in place to make it profitable. Local project developers, also private consumers, still need to get the idea of storage also as a business model.
The regulation needs to be done. So today, an end consumer wouldn't have any advantage in putting energy storage on their own. So we still need some basic regulation that incentivizes, for example, different prices on electricity during different times of the day, or the opportunity of providing ancillary services and being remunerated by that, establishing these conditions for an energy provider, energy storage provider, to have a place in this market.
All right, so that's more like a future scenario. But once these roadblocks are taken care of, it's probably very likely that storage might catch up with the PV trend. I still have so many questions, but let's speed things up. One very interesting topic that's also relevant for Brazil is because I think you have 1 million Brazilians still that live without electricity. Right. So I'm quite sure that the development of the off-grid sector is quite relevant for you as well. So yeah, is that a relevant market? Is that just more like an internal thing? What would you say?
Well, it's a relevant market that in the past was actually the market number one for solar in like 30, 40 years ago. It stayed a little bit dormant because it was a small market compared to the other segments. But the federal government has started a new program called Mais Luz para a Amazônia, more light to the Amazon region, where the majority of this population is located and they don't have access to distribution of electricity infrastructure or transmission lines available. So how do they get electricity nowadays? Either with small diesel generators, or they live using lamps without electricity, which is horrible conditions if you consider our digital life today. So this program from the government expects to bring to at least 72,000 families, that's roughly more than 220,000 people, electricity, using renewable energy sources mainly. And solar will probably be the source number one together with energy storage. So we have an opportunity there for solar projects and technologies based on off-grid systems to actually find a very interesting market that's about 10 billion reais. I would say that's $2 billion at least on a market size in the next few years. So this is something to look into if you are considering Brazil as well.
2 billion is a number. So if anybody listens here that is in the off-grid business, so to say, make sure to have an eye on Brazil. And by the way, the impact is quite significant. So if I got the numbers right, that would almost take care of a quarter of the people that still are without electricity, which is a significant impact. Now, the two remaining questions I have is a little bit of myth busting, because here in Europe, if we have our discussions, there's two things that come up. One thing is that, some people are like not jumping on the train in regards to electrifying personal transport, so electrifying cars, and they're still like, oh, we should go down the synthetic road, we should stay technology open or agnostic, because what about the other region and export markets of the world, like Brazil with the long stretches? Is that true? Do Brazilians think the same way? Do they think like, well, we have such long routes, such a huge country, we can't electrify? Is that actually true?
Well, that's not actually the mindset of Brazilians, I have to say, because first of all, it's important to understand that Brazil today has one of the biggest biofuel programs in the world. So we use bioethanol produced from sugarcane, we use biodiesel, right? And these programs are part of our today life. If you buy gasoline in a gas station in Brazil, it has a minimum of 10 to 15% bioethanol mixed into it. That's obligatory. The same is true for diesel. So it gets biodiesel mixed into it. And you can buy 100% ethanol and drive your car with ethanol. The Brazilian cars, we call these cars hybrid. So they can use with both fuels, gasoline or ethanol. And the third step is actually making a hybrid car, a hybrid electric car, and eventually a fully electric car. So the government planning agency foresees that it will take some time for Brazil to actually get big into electric vehicles, but I believe they are underestimating the potential of electric vehicles, because Brazil today is a big consumer of fuels, and this is a significant part of our emissions, as we discussed previously. So if we want to reduce emissions in Brazil, we have to look into electromobility. That is a way forward. And more, although the country is continental, that's true, people usually use the majority of their transportation inside cities, not outside cities. So there is no real resistance for using an electric vehicle, especially considering that the new technologies now have 400, 500, even more kilometers of autonomy. So that's pretty reasonable and comparable to a car fossil fuel car.
I think that was such an important statement, because it always comes up in debates here about going fully electric. And I think that really, if anybody out there still thought that it's a major roadblock for German automotive companies, and they're still like, oh, we still need some, combustion engines for the Brazilian market. No, it's not true here. Get it from Rodrigo live. On the long run, maybe not as fast as Europe, Brazil will also go almost fully electric. And they're not in such a hurry because they already are a step ahead when it comes to the footprint of transportation. But it also will go electric. That's such an important takeaway. But what comes right with that discussion often is, of course, is the question of hydrogen. One thing that I hear a lot recently is because we switch to hydrogen when it comes to decarbonize the hard to abate sectors such as the heavy industry. We're like, okay, we can't produce as much hydrogen here in Europe. Some we'll get from the MENA region, some from as far as Australia. But I think Brazil is also mentioned quite a lot. But how does it look from the Brazilian perspective? Are you actually looking at exporting clean energy, or do you have it reserved for your internal demand?
Well, first of all, it's important to explain that Brazil has already established and published a national hydrogen program. This is something that the government did last year. And this national hydrogen program has 6 areas that it's approaching as part of a strategy to make Brazil a relevant hub in hydrogen production. Important to say, we at ABSOLAR believe in the potential of green hydrogen. This strategy looks into different colors of hydrogen, so from different sources, but we do believe that green hydrogen has the highest potential of them all. And when we compare numbers from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, for example, they show that because of the low renewable electricity prices in Brazil, costs for production in Brazil can be the cheapest place in the world to produce hydrogen, according to their analysis. And this is quite promising data, but in our view, we're a bit pragmatic on that. We need to see the first contracts become a reality, and there are many memorandum of understandings already being signed between state governments, entrepreneurs, the federal government, different entities in Brazil, but these are memorandums of understanding. So we have to see this will become a reality, right? And once it does, I think this depends on contracts, on demand. Someone needs to be able to buy this hydrogen at a competitive price. Otherwise, these projects will stay on paper. So the answer would be, how much appetite does Europe, for example, has to buying the green hydrogen from Brazil, and how much it would pay? Depending on the answer, we'll see if these projects will move forward or not.
That's quite an interesting way to put it. But how big is the appetite of Brazil as a growing economy to use its very cheap green energy itself for scaling up the industry?
Well, the country still is growing quite a lot and strongly. Of course, we had some hiccups because of the pandemic, but that happens to the whole world. And the average per capita electricity use in Brazil is very small compared to Europe, because we're still a low to middle income country. So the expectation of electricity demand is very high, but we do have a lot of renewable resources. There is really no restraint in increasing this generation capacity, as long as we have market potential clients. So if the demand arises, Brazil is ready to serve the world in terms of producing electricity from green sources, but also green hydrogen.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm actually quite sure that Europe will develop a big appetite for clean hydrogen. There's no question. And for green hydrogen, there's no question about that. So we're almost at the end here of our podcast. We're sitting here as we speak and as we record on the second day of the Smarter E, taking first day of the exhibition, second day if you count in the conference. Now you came over here from Brazil. If we reference what we said earlier, the cultural difference. So what are your key takeaways of visiting the European markets? What are your key takeaways of the conversations here? Did you already clear up some misconceptions you had? What's happening here, for example?
Well, it's always a pleasure to be back here, actually, because I've had the opportunity to study during my master's and my PhD in Europe, in the UK, in Switzerland, in Germany. So it's for me, it's always a pleasure to be back. And I actually learned a lot. I would have to say that the new areas that are bringing a lot of interest, and we still don't have these markets so much developed in Brazil yet, so maybe they will come in the future. They have to do with energy storage. They have to do also with floating use of photovoltaics, where Brazil has a lot of hydro dams. We can use these reservoirs, but it's still something new. But this is moving forward here in the event and in the Congress. That was very interesting to hear about. And also the new intelligent and digital use of technology to help renewable energy penetrate more into the electricity matrix. So I think these are some concepts and ideas that we need to bring as soon as possible back to Brazil to get the evolution of solar and other renewable sources even faster there.
Nice. So those 2 points is like floating PV, a perfect combination with the hydropower, by the way, because it also blocks the evaporation of the water body. So that's perfect. And then, making grid smarter and making the use of renewables, increasing the use of renewables by using them smarter. Actually, I think we might have a chance, not sure if I'll be there personally, but the industry will have a chance to meet, I think, in South America at the Smarter E South America soon. Will you be there?
Yes, I'll definitely be there. It will take place in August. So I'm very much looking forward to meeting our friends from Brazil and abroad coming to this event, which is the biggest in the region, by the way, for the solar sector. And ABSOLAR is also a partner on organizing the content of the conference that will take place there together with the exhibition. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you guys in Brazil as well. Maybe you can also learn a few new things from us and a bit of our culture as well.
Thanks a lot, really, for having joined us today, Rodrigo. So cool that I could get you out there of the busy conversations you were having. And yes, really some key takeaways. Brazil is a completely different market from what we're used to here in Europe. You have a completely different mix of energy with different challenges that we have, but it is an interesting market. And so if people really want to enter it, it does make sense to have a partner that's locally based in Brazil, just for the cultural differences, but also because the regulation is very different, to understand the taxing system. And it's quite interesting to see the potential for PV, or maybe not now, but on the midterm as well, for storage, for off-grid. And then, as you said, floating PV, perfect match for Brazil. Yeah. Thanks a lot for having joined us.
Thank you so much, Zach. It was a pleasure.
So that was the second episode of our mini-series here, recorded live at the Smarter E Europe in Munich. For our third episode, we'll switch the topic completely, because what we will talk about is the second life of, for example, car batteries. And I'll talk to Claudius Jehle of Volitica Diagnostics, because it's quite interesting if you actually really tap into the second use of batteries. For example, for fleet operators for buses, it can be financially a very significant lever to get back on the up price that an electric bus is in comparison for a diesel bus, for example. But you really need to make sure that those batteries are used properly in their first use case. Why? This is what we'll find out in the third episode, so stay tuned. For more information on the latest market developments in South America, or to talk to industry insiders such as Rodrigo personally, visit the Smarter E South America, LATAM's innovation hub for the new energy world, taking place from August 23rd to 25th, 2022 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. You can find everything about the exhibition and conference online at thesmartere.com.br/home.